Welcome everybody, Tanaya, bienvenue. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this event hosted by the Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue featuring Adam Kahane on the occasion of the launch of his new book, Facilitating Breakthrough, How to Remove Obstacles, Bridge Differences, and Move Forward Together. Before we start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue is hosting this event on the ancestral unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, here in Kemkemale, the place of many maples, also known as Vancouver. For their generosity, partnership, and relationships, we are grateful. Tomorrow, Canada will recognize its first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. The Honorable Murray St. Clair reminded us today that this day of remembrance was one of the 94 calls to action forwarded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. It is sobering to think that of those 94 calls to action, only a mere 14 are implemented to date. Reconciliation is a matter for all people and goes beyond the simple dichotomy between the recognition of rights or acts of benevolence. So it is necessary for us to all take part in repairing the deep relationships we have with this land and with its peoples. Tomorrow should not remain the only day we set aside to learn and hear Indigenous voices. At the center here, we are all committed to this continued learning journey and to uphold the calls to action of the TRC, as well as the 232 calls to justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. As such, we would like to encourage all of you to do the same and find your own way to engage in reconciliation, drawing from the knowledge generously shared with us by organizations such as Reconciliation Canada or the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Thank you. So we are hosting this dialogue on Zoom today, and I am told to remind people that we are recording this session. So if you do not wish to be on camera, we welcome you to turn your cameras off at this time. We will ask everybody to stay muted for the first part of this programming. There will be an opportunity later on for all of you to interact in the breakout sessions. We know Zoom is not always the most conducive to conversation, but we hope you will all take part in this programming in a respectful and in a way that helps share collective knowledge. At the Center for Dialogue, we do ground our dialogues in community agreements. So again, I really encourage you to enter this space in this spirit with humility and compassion for each other. There is no way for us to be in relation without connecting. We can connect when we ensure dignity for each other. Dignity is often eroded when we engage to try and win an argument rather than connect on a human level. So let's use this opportunity to dialogue and stretch our heart muscles a little bit. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our guest today. Adam Kahane is the director of Rios Partners, an international social enterprise that helps people move forward together on their most important and intractable issues. Adam is a leading organizer, designer, facilitator of processes through which business, government, and civil society leaders can work together to address challenges. He has worked in more than 50 countries and in every part of the world with executives, politicians, generals, guerrillas, civil servants, trade unionists, community activists, United Nations officials, clergy, and artists. Joining Adam today in this important conversation is Aftab Erfan, who is a long-standing scholar practitioner in the field of inclusion and social justice. She's currently serving as the City of Vancouver's first Chief Equity Officer. She was educated as an environmental scientist and urban planner. In 2013, Aftab completed a PhD in community and regional planning at UBC, where she subsequently taught for a decade, and completed a 4-year stint as Director of Dialogue and Conflict Engagement for the university. Aftab is a first-generation Iranian settler on Coast Salish lands who has worked as a facilitator and teacher on 4 continents. She is cautiously optimistic about the future of humanity, as she tells us. So welcome, very much, Aftab and Erfan and Adam, and thank you for joining us today. So in this portion, we are going to have a little bit of a fireside chat between the three of us to start unpacking some of the ideas presented in Adam's book. And I hope after that, our participants will also have a chance to connect and discuss the ideas that they found most compelling or perhaps a little bit challenging. So I'd like to start with you, Adam. And in your book, you talk about transformative facilitation. Can you tell us a little story that illustrates the power of transformative facilitation, especially when you're talking about complex and intractable situations?
I think you can't unmute.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Okay, yes, thank you. I could try to do a story on mute, but might not be so effective. So thanks, Elodie, for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see Aftab again after we think it's maybe 10 years. I'm glad that people were interested in joining this session. Yes, let me tell a story. I can tell more later, but let me tell one story and also just take a few minutes to try to explain what I mean by transformative facilitation. I've been working as a facilitator for 30 years, and the book is about facilitation in general, and the main idea of the book is that the world needs more and better collaboration, and therefore the world needs more and better facilitation, and that it offers a broader definition of who a facilitator is and what facilitation involves, and argues that in a world where we can't get very far with people everybody doing things on their own, or people telling other people what to do, this role of facilitation is becoming more and more important. So that's the general idea of the book. But my own work over these past 30 years has been mostly facilitating teams of people who are trying to do something very difficult and find that even though they wish they didn't, they need to work with people who, some of whom they don't agree with or like or trust. So the story, which was actually the inspiration for this book, is that 4 years ago, my colleagues and I facilitated the first workshop of several of a group in Colombia, the country of Colombia, just after the signing of the peace accords in the southwest part of the country, north of Cali, which was a very high conflict area during the 52-year Civil War, among landowners and other elites and Afro-Colombians and indigenous Colombians and the FARC and the ELN guerrillas and the so-called self-defense forces. So the peace treaty had just been signed, and now the question was, how can we start to move forward together again in this region? And we facilitated a meeting that probably would be familiar to those, or the general approach would be familiar to those of you who do facilitation. People were starting in a circle, introducing themselves, lots of group work in small groups with Post-its and Lego blocks and meals together and walks, etc. Anyhow, it was going quite well. And there was one man in the group who, and the participants were people from all of these groups, and people who including people who had literally been at war, and people from different political parties that didn't want any photographs because they didn't want it to be known that they were meeting together, and former guerrillas and peasant leaders, etc. And one of the participants in the group was a man named Francisco de Roo. He's quite a famous Colombian, a famous peacemaker. He's a Jesuit priest. And the week before, he had been appointed president of the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation, and Non-Repetition. In certain ways, the Murray Sinclair of Colombia, well, both in his both in how I experienced him, and also in the position he had just been appointed to. I was surprised that he came to this meeting, having just been given this job, but he said he was interested in how people could work together more effectively across difference, which was the work he was just starting and is still continuing. Anyhow, after the first day of the meeting, which was going pretty well as these meetings go, Francisco comes running up to me just before dinner and says, "Adam, I get it. I see what you're doing now." And I said, "Well, what am I doing?" And he said, "You're removing the obstacles to the expression of the mystery." So this was, I didn't understand what he meant, and we had dinner together, and I still didn't understand what he meant. In Jesuit thought, the mystery is not like an Agatha Christie mystery where you solve it at the end, but it means something that is intrinsically unknowable. So I still don't know what that means, but I found this idea of removing the obstacles to be very evocative. And this really was the starting point for writing the book. When I thought about it, I realized two things. Firstly, that most facilitators, at least when they're off duty, talk about their work in terms of how do we get people to do this, that, or the other thing. And I've always had the feeling that this was not a very productive orientation. And so when he said he didn't think it was about getting people to do things, but about removing obstacles, this already opened up a whole other way of thinking about it. And then that evening, I started to think about, well, if I understood this work as removing obstacles, what would that mean? I mean, what had I been doing, or what had my colleagues and I been doing? And I realized that that everything we do as facilitators, from the very first sitting in a circle, could be understood as removing the obstacles to three things: to connection, to contribution, and to equity. I'll just give one example, that when people sit in a circle and introduce themselves to each other, they connect because they literally see each other and all have a voice, or they connect because they see each other. They contribute because each of them has a voice and says something, and it is equitable in that, at least in that physical form, there's no hierarchy. So anyway, that was the beginning of the book. Now, if I fast forward to the end of the book, we'll get into the middle if you want later. But if I just fast forward to the end of the book, to the conclusion, I've really been trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? What are we removing the obstacles to? What is the expression of the mystery? And to make a very long story short, I now understand the essence of transformative facilitation to be about removing the obstacles to love, power, and justice. And that this is the deeper way of articulating connection, contribution, and equity. And I would further argue that actually, as facilitators, we cannot help people move forward together if we do not attend to removing the obstacles to love, power, and to the expression or the employment of love, power, and justice. Anyway, that's the long answer to your question. That's the summary of the book. I've saved you $19.95. There's some stuff in the middle as well, but anyway. Thanks, Elodie.
Thanks, Adam. You just used some very powerful words: love, power, and justice. And I would like to ask Aftab now, related to those three words, in your own practice, what opportunities do you see for this approach when it comes to making processes more accessible, more equitable, or how it supports group not feeling as invisibilized as they might have been in the past? And what's your definition of love, power, and justice as a facilitator?
Oh boy. That one is, I'm not quite sure I'm ready to define things, but I would say, I mean, first of all, to say, you know, what I really love looking through the book, and I haven't read every single word, but my overall impression was that it's a really important point that Adam started with, which is to point out the importance of facilitation if you want collaboration. I mean, in some ways it seems so obvious, but I think we often forget about that. It's like we expect love, power, and justice to kind of magically manifest when we bring groups of people together. And in fact, you need very, very deliberate and discerning facilitation to make that magic work. And I love this idea of more of us need to be facilitators. I even kind of, you know, go as far as to say that's the most important, if not the only role of leadership, is to facilitate processes for groups. So that seems really important. And then the other piece that I really loved is that there is this emphasis on what Adam is calling the outer game and the inner game. The outer game being, this is in the middle of the book, I think, but it's kind of things that you will do with groups, questions that you would put to the group. And the inner game is about how you hold yourself and the conversation that you're having with yourself as the facilitator. And, you know, in connection, especially with love and power, I think this is very compelling in terms of talking about or thinking about the inner game, and like, how am I holding myself? Where, you know, as a facilitator, so often where I find myself getting caught is in my own sense of I'm not going to be loved, or like I should be exercising power in a way that I'm not. Like, my own issues around love and power are actually what often is getting in my way of doing a good job with the group, or serving the group, or you know, removing the obstacle, as Adam is saying, for something natural to emerge. So that's where I kind of went with like, that's where I was most interested as I was reading, was like, you know, where and you know, I would just say just a tiny bit about my practice, which is that I really come from the social justice world, and as many of you on this call already know, because I've worked in so many of these spaces in Vancouver, often what I'm wondering about in spaces that I'm facilitating is yes, how to remove the obstacles, even more basically, how to protect people. Like, how do I make this a space where we are not recreating the patterns of hurt and violence that are happening in a lot of our systems in the world? How do we create an alternative to the oppressive systems that run so much of our society? That's my core question. And it's a love question, you know, it is a justice question in so many ways as well. So yeah, I don't know that I'm defining any of those pieces, but they do feel like, and even this idea of justice as a way of weaving together love and power, I think there's a lot of possibility and potential in that. I would just also say, you know, where I was fascinated and had questions, and maybe we can get a little bit more into this conversation, is you use the word equitable hierarchy in terms of designing almost like the nuts and bolts of how does this transformative facilitation method or approach work. And as I was reading through, like, what examples of that might be, I was reminded of some of the things that I tried. So, you know, to your point, we can put people in a circle in a room, but that doesn't get rid of the power dynamics. So what are some of the facilitator moves and bits and pieces, both in the outer game and the inner game? to actually go in a way beyond equality and towards equity, which is not treating everybody the same, but being attuned to what people need in order to fully participate and feel in their own power.
Adam, would you like to respond to Aftab on that? Like, how do you operate this hierarchy of power or hierarchy of equity?
Okay, so thanks. Aftab, we met a long time ago, but I'm really excited or happy to be in conversation with you about this. And I'm furiously writing notes because you're pointing out things about this that haven't been clear to me. So thank you. So first of all, just to say, two things. Firstly, the book is arguing that this isn't a variety of facilitation. It's a new general theory of facilitation. So I know that sounds, well, that sounds general.
Grandiose.
But, yes, grandiose. But I want to be clear that I'm trying to provide a new language for something that all good facilitators are already doing, but for which at least this particular language doesn't exist. And I guess the less grandiose or the anti-grandiose part of it is, I'm not saying I invented any of this. I'm just offering a structured way of thinking about it. I had somebody write to me a few weeks ago, who I don't know, an 85-year-old man. I think he had taught facilitation or leadership for a long time. And he said, you know, so many of the things in your book are things we've done forever, but you provided a way of thinking about it. So the other point is, I'm using these three words, love, power, and justice, in a very specific way. I'm choosing to use these well-known words, these evocative words, but of course, they mean all kinds of different things, and I'm using particular definitions. And if you don't understand the definitions, what I'm saying is incomprehensible. And in particular, well, by love, I don't mean romantic love. I mean the drive to unite the separated, which in a way is the basic thing that happens when you're bringing together actors who have been separated. You're, in a way, the first move of facilitation is a love move, as I define it. I'm also, this is not romantic love. This is love as revealing a unity which has been obscured or denied. I'm defining power as the drive to self-realization. And this is not how, so I'm defining it as power to, whereas often people assume power means power over. And the way I got into all of this is by trying to understand this Martin Luther King phrase, power without love is reckless and abusive. Realizing yourself without any sense of connection to other people is reckless and abusive. And then he went on to say, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Just talking about unity without giving space to, or acknowledging the drive to self-realization of everybody is sentimental and anemic at best, and cynically reproducing of the status quo. So anyhow, I have specific definitions, and yes, justice as the form, in particular, the form that, and this gets exactly to your point, the form that prevents the power of some from obliterating the power of others. And I don't know of a better example, a more visceral example, than kneeling on somebody's neck. This is the power of some literally suffocating the power of others. So, so when you say facilitating a way that protects people, or that, yes, that prevents the oppression out there, or at least that makes visible the way in which the oppression out there is showing up in here, and in that sense is protective, or at least allowing space for it to be recognized and work with. That's what I mean in this case by removing the obstacle. A form of facilitation, a just form facilitation that that remove the obstacles to everybody being able to connect and everybody being able to contribute equitably. But I think your phrase "protecting people" is a very clear way of saying that.
So that's already leading us into a really interesting direction. You mentioned this drive for facilitators to try and be more equitable, to recognize the oppressions of the outside as they show up inside the rooms that you might be facilitating in. How do you see the evolution of facilitation in these past few years, when these oppressions have sometimes come to the fore in very strident ways, and sometimes made certain facilitators quite uncomfortable with the identities they hold and the form of power they sometimes represent for communities? How do you manage that? And this is a question for both of you.
Aftab?
All right, I can start. Just again to connect it to some of what Adam is doing in the book. This is the middle again, but you talk about vertical facilitation, horizontal facilitation, where vertical is essentially the attempt to say we are pursuing the good of the group or the will of the group. And the horizontal is we are pursuing the good of every individual within the group. So it's much more of a kind of the who is the who, you know, is the group the whom for which we're working, or is it the individuals? And I think what has become really apparent in this conversation about equity and the social transformation that we are really going through is that first, the kind of the vertical approach to facilitation, which is the dominant form of facilitating, you know, like most places, that's what we are doing. It's like we are driving towards some kind of everybody getting on the same page. I think the equity conversation is challenging this form of facilitation, this form of collaboration, this form of organization building, and is bringing much more attention to actually the individuals in that mix and their needs and their dreams and their desires and what they want to see. So you know, the book is essentially like a giant exercise of polarity mapping. I don't even know if you call it that, but it's this kind of like, if these are the two extremes of we pay attention to the whole or we pay attention to the parts, what is the kind of middle ground, or what is a compromise, or what is a mending or a blending of these two that does justice to both of these sides, if you will. So I think yeah, the conversation about equity, inclusion, diversity, it's really kind of, in some ways, evening the playing field between these two sides of this polarity, or giving more weight to horizontal way of facilitating, which hasn't got a lot of play. And so in that way, I think it's very exciting. I think, you know, to your point, Adam, it can also, if that's all we're doing and just playing in that space, we go to a kind of chaos, or, you know, everybody for their own, and we lose the whole. But I think it's an important move in that direction, the direction of the horizontal that has been enabled by the conversation about equity and inclusion. And yes, like I think all of us probably are navigating that transition. Those of us who are in marginalized identities in a different way from those of us who are, right? I don't think it's like straightforward or easy for anybody, but I do think we are coming to a better balance of taking these multiple considerations as we work with groups.
Yeah, so the summary you've given of the middle of the book is right on, and so just to take it a little bit further, and to answer your previous question about equitable hierarchy, which I didn't answer. So yes, I I argue that the most common kind of facilitation is vertical. And I use the word vertical because it contains a hierarchy of the larger over the smaller. You're in a vertical facilitation when somebody says, couldn't you just be more of a team player? Or can you leave your agendas at the door? We're looking at the good of the whole. And that has obvious advantages for coordination and cohesion, and it has serious downsides of rigidity and domination, especially domination of marginalized identities and participants. And I think 90% of the facilitation literature is about vertical facilitation. Mm-hmm. In other words, how do you treat the group as a whole? But I think the opposite, horizontal facilitation is the opposite. It says, no, that hierarchy is illegitimate, and we're going to prioritize the plural members of the group, their interests, their identities, their perspectives, and their individual choice in that sense, it's the opposite of the vertical. And the upside of that is autonomy and variety and diversity, but the downside, as you said, is fragmentation and gridlock. Now, here's the point, though, about polarities, and it's interesting you were doing this. When you were explaining it, you were foreshadowing what I'm about to say, which is, yes, when I started writing the book, I have a wonderful editor, Steve Piersanti, who says every book needs a bad guy. You have to say what it's not about. And when I first started writing the book, I thought the bad guy was vertical and the good guy was horizontal. Mm-hmm. But after I got into it and got some feedback, I realized that's not the most useful thing to say. The bad guy, if I can use that expression, is choosing either vertical or horizontal. And the good guy is working with both. And this, as you say, is classic polarity mapping, the way Barry Johnson explains it. And the analogy he gives is inhaling and exhaling. Nobody argues about whether it's better to inhale or exhale. You have to do both, not at the same time. You have to move back and forth between them. And that is the central idea, the central practical idea in the book, is that in order to be able to facilitate transformation, you have to employ both the vertical and the horizontal as needed. And because I come out of such a horizontal tradition, you and I know each other from Alia, which is, and from the art of hosting. These are very horizontal methodologies. I'm making the point that by itself is insufficient, and what's needed is to not a middle ground. That's in polarity. We don't talk about the compromise. It's not sort of horizontal, sort of vertical. No, it's full vertical and then horizontal and then vertical, and like breathing in and breathing out. And so I think you picked up a phrase in the book that I'm not sure is the best one, but I was trying to say, if the vertical is about hierarchy and the horizontal is about equality, what does it look like when you're moving back and forth between them? And I said equitable hierarchy, but that's it's not a very satisfactory phrase, and maybe there's a better one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it's equity. Maybe the word is equity.
Maybe it is equity. I mean, I like something about, it feels like a bit of an oxymoron, equitable hierarchy, which is what I think I like about it, because it does feel like you're working in an oxymoron when you're working inside a polarity. That is exactly what it feels like. And I was trying to think, what would be some examples of it very practically. And, you have this example in the book of, like a kind of a check-in when there's a 1-minute bell, and like everybody gets 1 minute to say something or introduce themselves or say something about where they're at. I actually think that's an example of equality. Now, it does challenge the hierarchy, because if you just left it completely to people with more power, positional power, so to speak, will probably take up more room, or the CEO in the room feels like they can talk forever. Like that is true. You're making it more equal. But I was kind of dreaming about, what if we were really trying to undo the inequities in our society? Maybe we actually, it's not a 1 minute bell for everybody. Maybe it's like the people who have never got to speak, but who are finally here in this room, they get 3 minutes, and you know, the people who've always spoken get 1 minute, or like we almost do like a map of your social power, and you get more time if you have, so like that to me would be, it's very hierarchical, but it's more equitable. Like it is undoing the systems of inequity that we've already had. So I'm kind of attracted to that notion of equitable hierarchy, and not so much the word, but this sort of well-engineered ways of undoing some of those inequities, which is like, if we just actually treat everybody the same, it's not going to happen. It needs to be more intentional and coordinated than that.
I would like to ask you a question, Aftab, related to that sort of model you just described.
Mm-hmm.
We talked earlier about the need for connection, contribution, and equity in these sorts of conversations that you facilitate. How do you create connection if people do feel they're being separated out into these categories? How do you ensure that that notion of equity is brought forward in a way that makes everybody feel they can still be seen, heard, contribute, and not reverse certain oppressions? Sometimes we can get accused of when we try to introduce these models of more equitable participation.
Oh yeah, I mean, we get accused of all kinds of things all the time. I don't think it means that we are on the wrong track. I do think, I mean, what you're bringing up for me is another very classic polarity, which is the kind of, it's like, are we the same or are we different? And the conversation about equity often emphasizes our difference, or that's the starting point. And I think at the same, I mean, you know, like if you really look at it, both of these are true. We are different, and we are also, there's a oneness, there is a sameness. Again, because sameness, it's like it goes with the vertical facilitation thing. It has been the dominant view for such a long time. There's like this kind of resistance and reaction to it in this moment. But I think as a facilitator, I mean, like this is the other polarity that I'm really aware of. Like, what questions am I asking that's bringing out the sense of sameness, and what are the questions that are bringing out difference? And they do very different things. Like the conversations about difference are controversial. Like there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of energy. The conversations about sameness are calming and stabilizing, but if we stay in them, it's kind of boring, you know, and we don't get the benefits of diversity and of different views in the room and different identities in the room. So I think, I do think it is, I mean, you know, that part of it is also, what is that line about, if you're a privileged person, equality will feel like oppression. I think there's a little bit of that in the mix of, sometimes I see people reacting to the naming of difference as like that's a really bad thing, and like we kind of gravitate towards the oneness very quickly. But if we can hold it in a kind of like, it's not threatening. There's actually something interesting and energizing about difference. We can have it in the room. And I do think definitely in the social justice movement, there has been a tendency of like, here are the good people and here are the bad people, and we need to move out of that. But it's like naming differences and naming oppression without necessarily making the other people in the room the bad guys. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of, I feel like I'll have to go into a lot of examples to really explain, but I hope that's making some sense.
Thank you, Aftab. Actually, I'm going to pose a similar question to Adam, a little bit related to that. So Adam, you talk in your book about fear and how it can block exactly that contribution, connection, and equity. As facilitators who have to navigate between these different polarities and perhaps start to embrace this breathing, inhale, exhale, going from vertical to horizontal facilitation, embracing connection, but also naming difference. How would you counsel a facilitator in how to practice dealing with that fear so they can go into this respiration in a better way?
Firstly, Aftab, I really appreciate what you're saying about the equity lens on this, because I hadn't thought about it that way, and it's really interesting to me. So thank you. This work, facilitation work, is not straightforward or easy, and at least that's my experience of it. And so I'm often worried or frightened, and I don't have any way of, I don't know any magic trick to avoid that. I guess people say about fear that it makes you, it's helpful in that it makes you alert. I mean, this is not exactly what you asked, but it does remind me of a facilitation story that years ago when I was working in Colombia during the Civil War, we were in a workshop, and methodologically we came to a very tricky part of it. It wasn't conflictual, it was just a very complicated thing we had to do. And one of the participants said, "Adam, I can see you're really nervous or something like that." And I started to apologize. And he said, no, this is very helpful. We realize, okay, this is a crucial point, and it helped us pay attention. So this is the positive part. You realize, well, something's going on here, pay attention. And this for me, sorry, I'll come back to the fear, but the key idea in transformative, the key inner quality required for transformative facilitation is paying attention. Okay, so fear is a problem only in as much as it distracts us from what's going on and gets us into this other thing, not about the here and now, but about the then and there, or I wonder if they don't like me, or I wonder if I'm going to get kicked out, or if I'm not going to get paid, or if they think I'm a bad person or whatever. So the way I think about that is, I had some facilitation training years ago, and I remember the teacher saying, be aware or beware. In other words, if you're not paying attention, if you're not clued into what's going on in the group, in the system, in yourself, then watch out, because your things are going to go really bad. So for me, the progress is not that I don't get scared, or that I don't make mistakes, or that I don't get flummoxed, but that I can notice it and recover more quickly. And so, things that 20 years ago I would sulk about for 6 months, now I only sulk about for a week. And things that would throw me off for half an hour, maybe now will throw me off for 2 minutes. I'll just give an example of this because it came to my mind when you mentioned tomorrow, the national holiday tomorrow, is that for me the most interesting chapter in the book, or the one that I really wanted to write, is the one just before the conclusion, which is about one of the particular polarities between standing outside and standing inside. Logically, it could have come earlier in the book, but for me, that's the bottom line, is where are you in the system? And I tell the story of facilitating with some First Nations colleagues in Manitoba and being challenged by one of the participants, a former chief named George Moosewagon, who said he didn't trust me. And at that moment, how frightened I was, and how frightened our whole settler First Nation facilitator team was, that the whole thing was going to fall apart and people wouldn't participate and the project would be over before we started. But I individually, and we as a group, managed to grasp what was happening and change tack within a matter of 15 minutes and get back on track. So I don't know a way to not be afraid, but I do think being aware and being able to say, okay, this is not what I expected, and this is difficult, and I don't know what to do, or but let's take a breath. What can I at least do next? And sorry, I want to put a parenthesis here because I noticed I used the word tack, which for those of you who are sailors is a sailing term, but it's something I wanted to say. So when you're sailing a small boat, I grew up sailing small boats, you know that it's impossible to go straight into the wind. So you have to take one tack and then the other, starboard and port. And that's a very good metaphor for vertical horizontal. And if you're in a small boat, I sail a laser, there's even a little piece of string on the sail that to notice how is the wind right now. And if you don't notice, you'll collapse. So this idea that, first of all, moving between vertical and horizontal is about tacking back and forth. You can't just go right down the middle. And that the key is to pay attention to the wind and the water and your weight and keep adjusting as you need to. So it's the awareness, which is the critical thing, not the not being afraid, or at least I don't know how to do the not being afraid part.
Thank you for that. And I will read this quote from your book, which I actually wrote down and is sitting in front of me. Pay attention, the rest is interpretation. Go practice. So maybe it's a call for all of us to actually stretch those facilitation muscles a little bit more, which I think is a good segue into the next portion of our program. We like people to talk to each other and have conversations. We don't like to be the only ones talking. So we're going to invite all our participants today to join a breakout room with one of our lovely facilitators from the center to have a little bit of a conversation about what you heard so far, what excited you, what maybe challenged your own perceptions of the work of a facilitator. So you'll have about 15 minutes with your lovely facilitators in a small group. And at the same time, we would encourage you to also note some of the questions you might have for Adam and Aftab. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I hope that was a nice opportunity to connect with folks in the breakout rooms and just have a nice chat. I'm going to encourage people to share their questions they may have for both Adam and Aftab through Slido. So I'm posting that in the chat. You can go to slido.com with the code that's in the chat, and that will enable you to put in your questions for Aftab and Adam. And you can also vote for the questions that you see on there. If you like a particular question, you might want to bring it to the top. We're going to have about 15 minutes to go through the questions with people. So I will just keep an eye on what is coming up here. But I think we had a first question that was posted in the chat. So I'm going to go back to it and we can start with this one. So Adele asked, as people become less homogeneous in dialogue, how do we deal with culture clashes? For example, Western calmer style versus African or Italian, etc. dialogue style. So different styles of showing up in dialogue. How do you deal with that?
Which of us is that for, Elodie?
It's for both of you, whichever one of you wants to take a stab at this question.
Aftab is silent, is being not allowed to unmute. So
Let's see if we can get that sorted.
Okay, you did.
There we go.
I guess then I should start. Is that I think just so first of all, this is a little bit of a tricky question because it's almost on the edge of taking us into some stereotypes, like Western is like this and African is like this. And I think that's not really true, but there is definitely something about people have different styles, and depending on where we come from, that style might be different. There is a whole bunch of literature, and it's actually old. It's well, I shouldn't say that it's from the 70s and 80s, but it's literature on how African American communities in particular found group agreements and meeting etiquettes very oppressive. Like this idea of everybody is going to be polite and take your time, you know, but when it comes down to you, you get to speak for 5 minutes and you know, like really be very respectful and don't raise your voice. This has been critiqued actually quite well, I think, within the facilitation literature. And I think we are really in this moment of, if you want equity, we need to be thinking differently about those group norms and sort of, and I don't have any kind of definite answer of this should now be our group norms, but I do think they need to be negotiated. Like what I often find is when you come into a meeting, the facilitator will say, okay, and we'll have some group norms, like nobody interrupt and everybody, you know, like be kind of respectful of each other. And that is just gonna get us into a certain type of meeting, which we've already had a million times. You know, some of the agreements that I've made, like I facilitated a few years ago when I was at UBC, this kind of amazing dialogue between our students who were like the social justice students, we call them equity ambassadors, and this group of essentially like alt-right students who were creating like the free speech club, and if there was like this huge division within the student body, and I facilitated this dialogue between them, and we spent a lot of time on group norms and how are we going to talk with each other, and what came, so, and I didn't suggest any, I just kind of went with like a totally blank slate and kind of canvassed it from the group, and they came up with really specific things. Like one that I always will remember, it was like, we are going to allow ourselves to be a little bit more open in this conversation. We're going to actually tell the truth, but we are not going to use words that we know are provocative to the other side. And this is actually really important in the social justice realm, because there are definitely words that, you know, will blow the room up basically, and will destroy connection. And so the decision of, we will be open and honest, but we won't use provocative words on purpose, it was like a really, really important ground rule. And I think, you know, falls outside of what we typically think of as ground rules. So I would be really kind of tailored, I suppose, to each conversation. And in the methodologies that I come from, which is the biggest one that I was influenced by, is called Deep Democracy. It was created in South Africa, and the whole, we actually don't make group norms until we come to the moment of conflict, because at the beginning of the session, everybody's more or less fine. Like we think we can all be civil to each other. When there's conflict in the room and you're alert to it, the agreements that you're going to make are very different from what you did 2 hours ago. And those are the agreements that really matter for keeping the group protected, if you will. So I think that timing matters, and getting out of our typical mindset of this is what a good group is very helpful in making it just, you know, like less waspy all the time, if you will.
Thank you for naming that, Aftab. So I'm going to take one of the other questions that have been shared with us, and maybe we could go to Adam for this one. Adam, when participants don't trust each other, like in the example you gave with George Mooswagen, how do you make them more comfortable? The things that you can acknowledge.
Well, first of all, in the story I told from Manitoba, George wasn't saying he didn't trust the other participants. He was saying he didn't trust me personally. So,
so that's even worse in a way, or it's more complicated.
No, well, it was I found it a very challenging situation, but we found a good way forward. Somebody asked him to trust the process, and I said, and this isn't a general answer, this particular answer, but I said something that I thought in retrospect was quite inspired, which is that I wasn't asking him to trust the process. I in general think it's not a legitimate request, but could we go a little while longer and see where we got to, which he accepted, and we managed to find a way forward, and he and I got to be quite friendly in the time that followed. But I want to pick on that question, which I also saw in the chat, because when I give talks about this, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but when I give talks about this work, 100% of the time there'll be a question that contains how do you get people to, or in this case, how do you make people? And I'm not trying to be pedantic, but for me, the starting point for this is I can't make people do anything, really. I'm not saying because I wouldn't like to, I just don't have any success in making people do anything at all. So, and in particular, I don't want to pick on the questioner, but that's my starting point. That's for me, the definition of facilitation is that you can't, there's no place for force. There's no place for making people do anything at all. In that particular example, I didn't make George do something. I just said something that I thought was useful, and he accepted it, and we went on. But on the other hand, and here I'm going to hold the other pole off top of what you were saying 5 minutes ago. Yes, everything. Somebody said to me years ago, it's everybody's the same and everybody's different. It's like the Paris fashion show. Every year it's the same and every year it's completely different. So I think one of the most important roles of the facilitator is to provide or to propose structure in all kinds of ways. And yeah, anyhow, I'll just stop there. That to organize things in a way, obviously it's voluntary, you can't make people do anything, and sometimes or often you end up renegotiating the structure, but that this is a hugely productive role. It's I think, yeah, I think you said it yourself at the beginning, love, power, and justice don't happen magically. They happen because you organize a structure within which those can flow.
Mm. Mm. So I'm going to go to the next question. This one is about integrity. What does integrity mean to you as a facilitator? Do you ever struggle with facilitating a group that doesn't align with your values? So maybe going back to those moments where you really have to facilitate in a perhaps highly polarized moment, or in a group where, Aftab, you just described one of those groups where you have a very strong dichotomy between participants. How do you deal with that?
So let me answer, and Elodie, maybe you can just assign them so we don't give two answers to every question. I see there's a lot that, but I'll jump in on that one if I may. So for me, integrity means doing my job, and my job is not to take sides. My job is to help the group do what it's come together to do. So when I do have a strong, I find when I do have a strong opinion about the subject or about the people, I don't like some people, I like them. Somebody irritates me, I agree with some people. It's almost always an impediment. So I just think that there will be more than one way of defining integrity. And when I didn't mention it earlier, but I got my start in facilitation in South Africa in the early 90s, which was a very educational place to work for many interesting reasons. But one of my teachers there said to me that it's not that we, sorry, I'm trying to remember how he put it. the stand we're taking is not for one side or another, but there is a hidden ideology or the implicit ideology, which is that everybody needs to be included and to be able to contribute and connect equitably. Those are my words. But so I just think that integrity doesn't mean I agree with people or, anyhow, that's how I think about it.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick another question here that's coming up. And this is maybe for Aftab. How do you close a process when there has been no resolution or consensus, and where participants feel that they didn't get what they came for, or that they had to make concessions, perhaps? So how do we deal with this notion that we're always seeking consensus when perhaps maybe that's not what we should be aiming for?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a way, that feels like most of the processes that I facilitate. Like, there might be some kind of, okay, we can agree on next step, but that's sort of all we have, or we have some little piece that we can agree on. I mean, I think, one thing might be to actually go in with that framing and expectation, like, we're not going to resolve racism in this meeting. We're not going to totally agree with what should happen with this project or something like that. And it's going to go on, like, some way or another, this project is going to go on. Let's see if we can get a little bit closer, right? If nothing else, we can understand where each other's coming from, so we can make it less bad. We can make it less damaging for people as we implement. I think that kind of setting up the expectations is important, especially when we're talking about these very fundamental, super polarized situations that we find ourselves in. And then the practice that I have at the end of a session, and this comes from deep democracy, but it's essentially the practice of sometimes when we are in groups, we take on ideas, emotions on behalf of other people who are in the group or maybe even aren't in the room. But some of us will get stuck with emotions that are bigger than we can handle, with fear or disappointment or anger or overwhelm. And I kind of, I do this practice of, let's leave them in the room. Like, we do not have to vacuum clean the entire universe. We do not have to resolve everything for everybody. These problems are going to be there. The overwhelm is going to be there. The anger is going to be there. We can kind of like, brush them off and leave them in the room, that we can go and be safe and not be endangered personally, because we are needed for this long game. I do think like some kind of ritual at the end, that we're not taking on huge responsibility to fix everything, is really important in these really contentious big issues.
Thank you. And so we have many more questions here, but unfortunately, folks, we're not going to have time to get through all of them, but I'm going to collect them all and share them with our speakers, and they might be interested in providing insights into them in other talks they do. But before we end off our day, we did have one of our students from the semester in dialogue who was here as a witness today. And I'm going to invite Michael to share a few thoughts on what he heard and what he took out of this conversation. Michael, go ahead.
My goodness. Thank you, Elodie. And thank you, Adam, for the talk as well. I definitely learned a lot about sailing and also about dialogue. I think one of the things that stood out to me in particular, especially about the sailing example, the tack thing, it made me realize how futile, I guess, it is sometimes to have a very rigid agenda, and that switching between the two different tacks, right, between vertical and horizontal, and using them as needed, right? The importance of that, because I think sometimes when people think of like a balanced discussion, they think of just giving slotted time to each type of discussion, when really, I think reading the room and realizing when to switch between the two and gauging how participants feel. I feel like that may be the more effective way to go. Also, I suppose thank you, Adam, for calling me out on the question that I submitted earlier, which was, how to make participants feel more comfortable. Because when you pointed that out, the futility of trying to change how people feel, and it made me realize, like, yeah, I guess it is kind of not the most effective way to go about things. And that kind of got me thinking about maybe my biases towards that. I wonder if maybe there's like a focus in modern society or in academia on like persuasion and argumentation and trying to get the other person to like see how you feel, see the way you see things, as opposed to kind of letting things have their space. So yeah, thank you. And everything you said about like the hierarchy versus equality and the equity, I think was really very very useful as like a model to think about when approaching dialogues. Just one last thing I guess I'll go over. In the breakout rooms, Jonas, he asked us what are some of the most challenging aspects of dialogues for us. And what I answered was that I often have trouble finding good questions, particularly questions that don't just cater to one specific individual, but allow other participants the opportunity to kind of jump in. If I could just offer a brief example. A few days ago, we had a man named Maurice. He was an Indigenous lawyer and a storyteller with us, and we were thinking of questions to ask him. And I was going to ask him about, his university experience, what favorite professors or courses he had, and then I had like a classmate of mine kind of pulled me aside as I was thinking of that question. He said, that's too focused on him specifically. It doesn't allow kind of room for other people to jump in. And so instead I came up with, I guess, another question, which was regarding wastefulness, because I remember that Maurice was talking about wasteful practices in the food industry. And so I came up with a different question. I'm like, here's a question for Maurice, but also everybody, if anybody wants to join in. Have you found examples of wastefulness just in your everyday life? And suddenly other people, like Maurice went first, obviously, but other people jumped in as well. They had stories of like, oh, I worked in a restaurant, I threw away lots of food, or like, I have this friend who organizes a thing where we take seafood that's about to be thrown away and give it to cats. And so that just got people thinking. And so I guess I realized that the type of questions you ask are very important. Which is not to say that I guess specific focused questions towards an individual aren't sometimes useful, especially to kind of get to know people better or kickstart conversation. But having that balance, and I guess Adam was kind of and Aftab and everyone else was kind of mentioning reading the room and finding out when to switch between the two, and also giving the whole notion of equity, right? Giving people who maybe don't feel comfortable or don't speak a lot, giving them more opportunity to voice their opinions, I think is really an interesting concept. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. So Adam and Aftab, maybe in 1 minute each, what would be your best piece of advice to our budding students in dialogue when it comes to facilitating breakthroughs and creating that sense of connection, contribution, and equity in the rooms they might be in?
Can I go first? Okay. Maybe I'll double up and take this to also answer a question that came up in my small group, which was about how do you develop the inner skills? Like, how do you work on your inner game? And this observation that most facilitation training doesn't include that piece or is not very explicit about that piece. I would say I think that's the most important piece. I was very lucky to have the methodology that I was learning would totally fall apart if I lost my own sense of tranquility and non-attachment in the process. So I started going, I had supervision basically every month, and this is 15 years later, I still have supervision
every 2 months now. But I think it's like a lifelong process. For a lot of us, our spiritual practices also could be a support for developing those inner skills. But I actually don't think this facilitation thing works without developing those. And so if you can find some kind of ongoing container, it might be your cohort of other students, or you might actually find a coach or a supervisor to work with long term. A therapist, if you have nothing else, I would highly recommend it. That's the thing that makes the biggest difference, I think.
Thank you. Adam.
Well, I think that's, I agree with that advice, or I would give the same advice, and maybe in a more conceptual version of this. For me, one of the crucial points, which is the one I describe in this chapter about my work in Manitoba, is this idea that the phrase, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, is not really the key point. The key point is, if you're not part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. If you don't see how what you're doing is contributing to things being the way they are, then it follows logically there's nothing you can do to change the way things are, except from outside by force. So again, it's a polarity like most things. It's so what I'm saying is half true, but the half that's important to me is you have to keep coming back to, what am I doing and what can I do differently? Because you can't make anybody do anything. So that's, and if I'm going to double up, I would say that the other piece of advice is, I think facilitation is much more important than it's generally recognized to be. You know, in French, the word for facilitator is animateur, which is the same word used for people who lead games on the beach at Club Med. So this image of the facilitator as the, you know, the jokester who keeps time and does icebreakers. I actually think it's a crucial thing. Yesterday, I had the thrilling privilege of interviewing Cristiana Figueres, who was the woman who over 6 years negotiated or facilitated the negotiations that led to the Paris Accords. Just absolutely brilliant woman who, and I'm interviewing 3 people like that. I interviewed Trevor Manuel from South Africa, Cristiana Figueres, and next week, Juan Manuel Santos, who was the president of Colombia when they signed the peace treaty, because I'm trying to show that, or I'm trying to demonstrate that there's no limit to the potential contribution of facilitation. So I put this in the chat. I encourage any of you who are interested to join the last of these 3, because I think we have a big role to play. So let's train ourselves well and practice and be humble, and there's a lot to be done.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you for spending an hour and a half with us this afternoon and really helping us think through what a practice of facilitation could evolve into over the years. And maybe with these last words of pay attention and go practice, I will let folks go off, but just a reminder that if you're interested in purchasing Adam's book, our tech team is just going to put that in the chat right there for you, so you can have the links, and I will put that on the screen as well. We do have events on a regular basis here at the Center for Dialogue, so please subscribe to our newsletter and you'll be able to get access to those. And just on another note, because these ideas are so important to spread, and Adam's work has been so beneficial to many of us facilitators, I would encourage you, if you do buy the book, please put a little review on any of the websites that you use for your books, whether it's on Amazon or Goodreads or any other platform of that nature. It helps other people see how interesting these books, these resources are. So really encourage you to do that. And with that, thank you so much, everyone. Have an excellent rest of the day, and hopefully many more effective, productive, and collaborative dialogues in the future. Take care, everyone.